When discussing different training variables, we usually just take the average findings and apply them to our training routines. However, in reality, everyone responds slightly differently to different training protocols, and we all have different lifestyles. So in this video, we will discuss how to tailor your training routine to make it more effective and practical for you as an individual. First, let's explain why we should even attempt to individualize our training routines in the first place. Well, the reason why it may be a good idea is because everyone is slightly different. We are different in two primary ways, through our individual response to training and through our individual lifestyles. Our individual response to any given training intervention will likely be different from person to person. We often use research to try and make the best training decisions possible, but this often just reports the mean findings. This means that the general advice provided is likely to be highly effective for most people, but it may not be the best way to train for you specifically. There are two primary factors influencing this. First is our resistance training experience and current training protocols. Based on how long we have been lifting and what our current training routine looks like, we may see different results with different training styles. This was demonstrated in this study, which looked at the effects of an individualized training volume based on a lifter's recent training programs. One leg was trained with an arbitrary 22 sets per week, which as we can see here was more than some trainees had previously been performing and less than others had been performing. The other leg was trained with an individualized training volume of 20% more than what was previously being trained with. And as we can see, the individualized training routine saw superior quad growth compared with the arbitrary volume leg. This study suggests that our training history will likely have an influence on how we respond to a new training routine. And the other factor influencing our individual response to training is our genetic makeup. This refers to our inherited DNA that ultimately determines how we respond to basically everything, including resistance training. This is something that cannot be changed, but we should just note that it will have a fairly large influence on muscle growth. For example, if we took a large sample of untrained people and put them on a structured training program, some people will grow significantly more muscle than others. Most people would probably respond somewhere in the middle, but some would see much greater muscle growth, while others would see far less muscle growth. In real life, I'm sure we all know or have seen examples of people who seem to experience both better and worse muscle growth than ourselves. And the other reason why we may want to individualize our training routines is due to our individual lifestyles. This is probably a bigger and more important reason why training should be individualized, since our lives can vary substantially from person to person. For example, a professional athlete has their entire life working around training and optimizing performance, while an office worker with a family probably isn't in a position to maximize lifting endeavors. This doesn't mean that these people can't achieve great results, it just means that our training routines need to be realistic and suitable for our lifestyle. So the goal should be to maximize the effectiveness of your training protocol within the constraints of your individual lifestyle. So now we understand why training may need to be individualized. Next, we need to look at our individual circumstances, which will determine how we individualize our training routines. There are two primary factors influencing how we do this. The first and most influential factor to consider is your specific training goals and priorities. This is a concept where I find that many individuals get confused. Essentially, there are two primary goals that people train for in the gym: strength or muscle growth. Without going into too much detail, hypertrophy is essentially just growing bigger muscles. Strength, on the other hand, is a performance goal, where we want to lift more weight over time. While there are certainly similarities between the two forms of training, they are ultimately different outcome goals. For individuals focused on aesthetic or health-related goals, hypertrophy should be the primary focus of your resistance training routines. However, if your goal is to compete in a strength sport, or you are training for athletic performance, or if you just want to be able to lift more weight as a personal goal, then strength should be your primary focus. So the first step is to make sure you are actually focusing your training on the outcomes that you want to achieve. For this video, we will purely be discussing hypertrophy training, not strength. So the rest of this video will be focused on how to individualize our training routines specifically for muscle growth. Once we know what our specific training goals are, we then need to determine our practical constraints. In other words, how much time and effort we are willing to dedicate to lifting. Like we mentioned earlier, our individual lifestyle will largely determine this, based on our work, family, and social life. Some people have more free time to comfortably go to the gym, while others don't. Alternatively, some people may have the time, but they simply would rather spend their spare time on other activities, which is completely fine too. However, it should just be understood that this will determine to some extent what we can feasibly perform in the gym. So ultimately, our individual lifestyle and our personal willingness to train will influence our training routine. Now that we have explored why we should individualize training and the factors influencing how we do this, we can finally start to explore how to manipulate different training variables to suit you as an individual. Let's now cover each relevant variable. The first is training volume. In the context of hypertrophy training, volume refers to the total number of hard sets performed per muscle group per week. We generally find that more volume tends to result in superior muscle growth, assuming all other variables are equated. For example, this study explored the effects of training with 16, 24, or 32 sets per muscle group per week. Even up to these extremely high levels, trainees still experience superior muscle growth with higher volumes for all muscles measured. However, more volume probably doesn't linearly result in greater muscle growth. Rather, there is probably diminishing returns as volume increases. This was established in this systematic review, which found that moderate volumes, as defined by 12 to 20 sets per muscle group per week, were definitely superior to low volume training, which was defined as less than 12 sets per muscle group per week. However, high volume training, so greater than 20 sets per week, was only marginally superior to moderate volumes. So the volume hypertrophy relationship probably looks something like this. More volume seems to result in superior muscle growth, but each additional set may result in less additive hypertrophy. So ideally, we would all be able to train with fairly high volumes. However, more volume has a direct relationship with time spent in the gym, because obviously doing more sets means your workout takes longer. So not everyone has multiple hours per day to train with very high volumes. Some people may train 6 times per week for 1.5 hours, while others may only train 3 times per week for a quick 30-minute session. So quite clearly, those who have more time and effort available for training can perform more volume, while those who have less time and effort available will need to train with less volume. However, the good thing is that we can still achieve great muscle growth with slightly lower volumes. For example, if we were to perform this much volume here, we would still probably achieve 80 to 90% of the muscle growth that we would have achieved by performing substantially more volume. So the bottom line is that we probably want to perform as much volume as possible within our time constraints. For some people, they may be happy with getting the majority of potential results with less volume, while others may want to absolutely maximize muscle growth by spending substantially more time training with higher volumes. This will be different for everyone, so you need to make your own informed decision. Another individual consideration regarding volume is what I like to call volume allocation. This refers to how we distribute our volume across the various different muscles of the body. Like we mentioned, more volume is generally going to result in a faster rate of muscle growth, while less volume may result in a slightly slower rate of growth. So we can strategically allocate volume to different muscle groups based on what we want to prioritize. In general, we want to allocate more volume to our lagging muscles or the muscles we want to particularly emphasize, and less volume to our stronger muscles or the muscles we aren't as concerned with developing. For example, let's say a lifter wants to bring up their biceps and calves, has well-developed hamstrings and chest, and the other muscles are fairly proportionate to the rest of their physique. This lifter may allocate their weekly volume in the following way. As we can see, we have 20 direct sets of calf and bicep training, 15 sets for the back, triceps and quads, and 10 sets for the hamstrings and chest. So the calves and biceps should see a faster rate of growth compared with the other muscles, while the hamstrings and chest should see a slightly slower rate of growth. Therefore, trainees should distribute volume in accordance with their individual priorities. The next variable to discuss is how to individualize our training split. This refers to which muscles are trained on which days. The training split we implement will be based on two primary factors: how many sessions we can realistically perform in the gym each week, and how many times per week we train each muscle group. Let's look at each of these two factors separately. First is how many times per week we can realistically train in the gym. Similar to the volume discussion, our training split is ultimately going to be constrained by how much time we have available to work out. So rather than trying to find the theoretical best training split, we should be trying to find the best split that fits our individual constraints. Some people may be able to lift 6 times per week, while others may only be able to lift 3 times per week. Either way is fine, it is just a matter of our personal lifestyle and preference. So within our individual workout frequency, we now need to determine how many times per week we want to train each muscle. The evidence suggests that the number of times per week we train each muscle probably doesn't influence muscle growth all that much when total weekly volume is equated. However, a higher frequency appears to be slightly superior compared with training a muscle group only once per week. For example, this study explored the effects of hitting each muscle 1 versus 3 times per week with the same volume and exercises. It was found that the higher frequency routine resulted in slightly superior muscle growth for all muscles measured compared with training each muscle once per week. So while frequency probably doesn't have a major impact on muscle growth outcomes, higher frequencies are probably a little better. As a general rule, we probably want to try and train each muscle at least twice per week if possible. Therefore, trainees should arrange their training split so that each muscle is trained at least twice per week within their workouts. For example, someone who can only train 3 times per week may benefit from a full body split each workout so that each muscle is hit 2 to 3 times per week, while someone who trains 6 times per week may prefer something like a push-pull leg split, which trains only a few muscles each workout, but because of the higher workout frequency, each muscle is still hit twice per week. So in reality, there is no best or worst split to choose from. Rather, we should just try to hit each muscle at least twice per week if possible, and distribute this however you want to across your number of weekly workouts. The next way to individualize our training routines is through exercise selection. This refers to which exercises we implement to train each muscle group. But before we get into the details of how to individualize exercise selection, we need to reiterate an important concept. Remember, the goal of hypertrophy training is to stress the muscle we are trying to train. And exercises in the gym are all just forms of stressing the muscle. So there are no mandatory exercises that we must perform. Rather, we can implement many different movements to train each muscle group. Now that we have clarified this point, let's now get into the details of how to individualize exercise selection. This will be based on a number of different factors, which we will now cover individually. The first and probably most important consideration is joint stress. This refers to the tension experienced by the joints and connective tissue involved in the movement. Excessive joint stress over time can result in pain or irritation, and pushing through this may result in chronic injury. So obviously, if we are in pain, we can't really train very effectively, so we want to minimize the risk of this occurring. However, some exercises naturally tend to cause each person more or less joint irritation. Some people can comfortably do certain movements pain-free, while others cannot perform that lift without some discomfort. This is probably due to factors like our anatomical bone structure and our injury history. Because there are no mandatory exercises for hypertrophy training, we should try to avoid the exercises which cause high joint stress. Rather, switch them for some other exercises which train the same muscle group that feel more comfortable on the joints and provide a good stimulus to the target muscle. This leads us nicely onto the next factor influencing how we individualize exercise selection, and that is the perceived stimulus of the exercise. This refers to the sensations of how the exercise feels in terms of stimulating the target muscle. This usually refers to sensations like the mind-muscle connection, the muscle pump, and muscle soreness. These aren't direct measures of how effective an exercise is, but they can certainly be useful feedback to determine the general effectiveness of a training method. If we get a good mind-muscle connection during the set, a good pump in the target muscle after a set, and we are sore in the target muscle the following day, then that is probably a good sign that the muscle was trained effectively, or at least stressed to some extent. These sensations can be used as general indicators to select certain exercises in your training routine. If there are 2 or more exercises that you are considering in your routine, which all feel safe and healthy on the joints, then you may be able to preference one over the others based on the perceived stimulus. If one exercise scores fairly high on all sensations, while another exercise scores poorly, then it may be a good idea to lean towards the exercises which you get the best perceived stimulus from. Now, this is likely to be different for everyone, so make sure you find what provides you with the most effective stimulus. And the last consideration regarding individualizing exercise selection is somewhat of a combination of the previous 2 points, which is the stimulus to fatigue ratio. This refers to how much of a hypertrophic stimulus the exercise provides versus the amount of fatigue it induces, which includes joint stress and systemic fatigue. We won't get into all the details regarding this concept, but essentially we want to preference exercises which provide more of a hypertrophic stimulus and less overall fatigue. The reason why this can influence the individual exercises that we implement into our training routine is because we may select exercises that involve a more or less favorable stimulus to fatigue ratio depending on our goals. In some cases, it may be a worthwhile trade-off to include high fatigue movements, while in other cases it may not be. For example, if a lifter has lagging quads, it may be worth it to implement squats into their routine. Although this is quite a high fatigue movement, it also provides a great stimulus for the quads too, so the trade-off is worth it in this case. However, for a lifter who naturally has well-developed quads and wants to preference their upper body over their legs, they may decide to implement less taxing exercises like leg extensions. This will save more time and energy for upper body training rather than being heavily fatigued by squats. Therefore, lifters may want to include or exclude certain exercises based on the stimulus versus fatigue trade-off. This will be highly dependent on your training goals, personal preferences, and time available to train. And the last variable that we can individualize in our training routine are the rep ranges that we train in. A good general rep range guide was established in this research review. The authors suggested that if we are training somewhere in the approximate 6 to 20 rep range and training close to failure, each set can be considered approximately equal in terms of muscle growth. However, the question becomes, where within this large rep range spectrum should we be training? Well, this will depend on 2 primary factors which we will now discuss. The first consideration is which exercises we have selected for our training program. Each exercise is usually more or less suitable to certain rep ranges. Without going into too much detail, free weight compound lifts are generally more suitable to be trained in lower rep ranges, around the 6 to 10 range, whereas machine-based isolation lifts are generally more suitable to be trained within the higher end of the hypertrophy rep range, around the 10 to 20 range. And exercises between these 2 categories are usually best trained with more moderate rep ranges, around the 8 to 15 range. So depending on the exercises you implement, you may shift between different rep ranges within the general hypertrophy spectrum. And the other factor influencing which specific rep ranges you train with is joint stress. Like we mentioned in the exercise selection topic, this refers to the tension experienced by the joints and connective tissue involved in the movement. In general, heavier loads will result in greater joint stress and an increased risk of injury compared with lighter loads. So if a trainee has particularly irritable joints, which may be a result of their inherent anatomical structure or past injury, then they may want to implement slightly higher rep ranges for the movements involving this joint. For example, a trainee may find that the barbell bench press irritates their shoulder joints when trained with lower rep ranges. So a strategy to mitigate shoulder stress could be to simply drop the load slightly and work in a slightly higher rep range. And this same concept can be applied to all other exercises too. So to summarize this video, let's establish some practical recommendations. First, we should understand that we are all slightly different individuals who have different lifestyles and respond slightly differently to each training stimulus. And this is why it is probably best to try and individualize our training routine to maximize muscle growth specifically for us. We can manipulate a few different variables to tailor a training routine to our lifestyle and goals. In terms of volume, we probably want to perform as much as realistically possible within our time constraints. And we should also allocate more or less volume to each muscle group based on which muscles we want to emphasize over others. Our training split will be determined by how many times we work out per week. Within this workout frequency, we can distribute our volume in whatever way we prefer, but try to hit each muscle at least 2 times per week. Exercise selection can be individualized based on which exercises feel safe and healthy on our joints, those which provide a good stimulus, and those which have a favorable stimulus to fatigue ratio for our specific goals. And lastly, we can individualize the rep ranges we train in based on the exercises we are performing, and alter rep ranges to potentially minimize joint stress.